Hey, today we'll be looking at how to use Sparklite with Microsoft's Power Platform. We'll be building a simple app using Microsoft Power Apps and then use Power Automate's flows to integrate the Sparklite API. Let's dive right in. The first thing we'll need to do is set up our Excel file, and for that I have the simple workflow set up already. It just has two numbers right here and uses a sum function to create the output. As always, when working with Sparklite application, please make sure to name your cells and ranges. So in this case, if you look at B1, it's named as xinput_number1. We'll use xinput as the prefix and xoutput for wherever we need the output to show up as. Once you've done this, make sure to save your Excel file, then go to Sparklite's application. In case you don't have an account, feel free to sign up. You don't have to enter your credit card details, but once you log in and you're on the dashboard, you can go on Create New API, hit Next, click Browse, and then choose the Excel file that you've just created. Give it a couple seconds, and this may take anywhere between 30 to 40 seconds, depending on how big the Excel file is, the number of formulas that you're using. What's happening in the back end is Sparklite's taking all your logic that's built on the spreadsheet file and converting that to code, which then spits out an API. Once that's ready, you will land on this page, and then from here you can click on View API, click on See API Details. A couple quick notes on this page. This is the endpoint that we'll work with. We'll make use of a post request that'll come handy later on. And here is what we have, a bit of an API playground where you can test your API. So let's say I'm going to use 5 as the first input and 7 as the second. Hit submit, give it a quick second there, and at the output you'd see the sum to be 12. You can also have the JSON view of both the input data that's going into the API request as well as the output of that API request as well. This comes handy depending on the kind of application that you're building and the different tools that you use. If you scroll down, you'll find a bunch of different integration guides that we have. My quick tip for everybody using APIs is to always try and test that on an external tool. For instance, you can use Postman. If you're comfortable making curl requests, you can make use of curl. But either way, always make sure to test your APIs on an external tool before you use in an application. Now that we have this information that we need, let's dive right into the Power App side of things. Let's start with the blank app right here. I'm going to go ahead and click Create. And for the app name, I'm just going to name this Sparklite. I'm going to leave the format to be tablet at the moment and hit Create. Give it a few seconds. And once ready, you'd land on this particular page right here. To start with, let's just use some of these basic components right here. So I'm going to use the text input field. This is the first text input. I'm also going to use a second text input field right here. We'll also use a button parameter to trigger our workflow. And finally, we will show the output on a text label right here. Next, let's navigate to Power Automate option right here. Click on Create New Flow. Then click on Create from Blank. From here is where we'll go ahead and create our logic. So the first step I'm going to do is say click Next Step. Type in a variable, or rather we'll initialize a variable. Let me just do that. Let's go ahead and rename this to something which is a little more easier. So I'm going to go ahead and say input1 so that it becomes a little bit easier to understand. And I'm going to use input1 val as the name for this particular variable. In terms of the type, I'm going to choose integer. For the value, you can just click on this and you'll find this pop-up show up right here. We'll choose the Ask in Power Apps option like so, and you'd find input1_value show up automatically here. That's good enough. Let's click on the next step once again and do the same thing because we need another input. So I'm going to type in variable or just var and then go down initialize variable. I'm going to make sure to rename this. So I'm going to type in input2 here, and here just as input1, I'm going to copy this and type in input2 val as a name for this. Same goes for type. I'm going to choose integer, and here I'm going to once again click Ask in Power Apps, and you'll see input2_value shows up right here. The next step would be to actually make the API call. So I'm going to go type in HTTP because that's the protocol that we'd be using, and you'd find this option right here. Well, let's go ahead and click the HTTP premium option right there. Let's go ahead and choose our method. In this case, we'll be making a post request, as you could notice here. The next thing we'll need is the URL, and for that, I'm going to go ahead and copy the endpoint right here. For the headers, you don't have to type these things. You can just copy the options that you find on our dashboard. I'm going to do the same thing for the value as well. In terms of the body, I'm just going to go there and let's say copy this body right here. While we don't need the entirety of it, for instance, we don't really need the request metadata. I'm just going to go ahead and select that and remove them. And for the first input and the second input parameters, I'm going to go there, just remove the static values and say input to val. That should show up right here under variables even at your end. So I'm just going to go ahead and click input one val right here. For the second input, input to val right here. The next step would be to parse the output that we'd receive from triggering our API. We can find that operation by typing in JSON here because we'll be parsing the JSON. So we'll use that option right there. As for the content, that's going to be the response body of the HTTP request that we're going to make. So let's select that. As for the output schema, and this is a mandatory parameter here, you can navigate to Sparklite's dashboard. You can copy this output JSON right here, go back to your app, choose the generate from sample option that you'd find here, paste the output, and just as before, we don't need some of these different parameters right here. So for instance, we don't need the response metadata. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. We also don't need some of these variables as well, so I'm going to remove it. The only thing we really need is the output schema. Let's just keep it to that and hit done, and you'll see that the schema is generated automatically. As the final step, we'll then have to just say respond, which would essentially show up a bunch of operations here, which is respond to a Power App or flow. And that's the option that we need. Create an output, go with the text option right here. For the response, I'm just going to take output sum. The value for that is going to be the parse JSON right here, which is the sum parameter that you find here. You can just click that. It's also important that you name your flow. I'm just going to name this Sparklite API like that. And finally, just go ahead and hit that save button. Now, this might take a couple seconds for it to go ahead and save, but once that's done, you will find that information just on this left tab right here. Now, this next step could be a little tricky because we'll be using a couple of these functions which are very specific to the Power App application itself. So for instance, if we want to invoke the Sparklite API, we'll have to call it right here. So that's Sparklite API and .run, because that's the function that we're using to trigger the flow. And as you can already see here, it's asking us for two inputs. That's input one value and input two value. And for that, we'll use the text input because those are the input fields that we have right there. We'll then use their text values right here. So that's .text. Another quick note to remember here is what we need is essentially the number input. So what we can then do is just convert these to numbers using the value function right here. Basically repeat the same thing for the second input. Instead of text input 1, I'm just going to replace that with text input 2. This just triggers the API. What we then need to do is essentially store the output that this generates as well. And for that, I'm going to go ahead and select and cut the entire function and say use a set function right here. And the variable name I'm going to give here is just say output, comma, and just paste the entire function that we originally wrote right here. Close that bracket, and you can see that there are no other errors here. Next, we'll go ahead and click on that text label, and instead of it being a static text value, what we'll use is the output that we just initialized earlier. And then if you use a period, you should see the output sum show up right here. Once this is done, go ahead and make sure you're saving the application before you run it. And once good, go ahead and click on that play button, which is for the preview of the app. And for the text input, let's try doing 3 and 5. The answer should be 8. I hit the button, give it a few seconds, and you'll see that the answer shows up right here. We can try this one more time. Let's say I do 13 plus 7, that should be 20. Hit that button, give it a few seconds, and you should see the answer show up as 20. So there you go. Obviously, this is one of the more easier use cases, but I hope you see that you can practically use Sparklite inside Power Apps to basically power any other kind of use case that you may have. I hope this video helped, and thanks for watching.